Arizona may be known for its deserts and rugged landscapes, but during Christmas, it hides a chilling side filled with ghostly tales and supernatural encounters, from haunted hotels to eerie forests, and from abandoned schools to shadowy figures on ancient bridges. Tonight, we'll explore 10 spine-tingling ghost stories from the Grand Canyon State. So, dim the lights, grab a warm drink, and prepare for a haunting journey through Arizona's haunted holiday history. Story number 1. The Shadow on London Bridge, Lake Havasu City, Arizona, is an unlikely place for an English relic. Yet there it stands, the London Bridge, transported brick by brick from England in the 1960s. A marvel of engineering and ambition, the bridge draws tourists year-round. But for all its charm, the London Bridge carries with it more than history. Local legends speak of something darker, a shadowy figure that appears on the bridge on Christmas Eve, vanishing as quickly as it comes, leaving an icy chill and a deep sense of dread. For Sam and Rachel Carter, a young couple who had just moved to Lake Havasu City, the stories of the haunted bridge were intriguing but hardly believable. On Christmas Eve, they decided to take a nighttime drive across the famous structure. The city was quiet, the streets nearly deserted as most residents stayed home for the holiday. "Do you think we'll see it?" Rachel asked, her breath fogging the car window. Sam shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "Probably just a story to spook the tourists. You know how towns like this are." As they approached the bridge, the air seemed to grow colder, even with the car's heater running. Rachel wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck. Glancing out at the dimly lit structure, the bridge stretched before them, its stone arches illuminated by old-fashioned lamps that cast long, eerie shadows on the water below. Halfway across, Rachel gasped, "Sam, stop the car." Sam slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the slick road. What is it?" Rachel pointed ahead. "There, do you see it?" In the middle of the bridge stood a figure. First, Sam thought it might be a pedestrian, but something about it was off. The figure was tall and cloaked in darkness, its edges blurred, as if it were a shadow pulled free from the pavement. It didn't move, didn't react to the car's headlights. It simply stood there, facing them. "Who the hell is that?" Sam muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. Rachel's voice trembled. "I don't think it's a person." Sam honked the horn, the sound echoing across the water. The figure didn't flinch. Frustrated, he inched the car forward, the headlights piercing the darkness. As they drew closer, the shadow seemed to dissolve, its edges fading into the cold night air. By the time they reached the spot where it had been, it was gone. Rachel shivered, rubbing her arms. "Did you feel that?" "What?" Sam asked, though he already knew. The temperature inside the car had plummeted, their breaths fogging the air despite the heater blasting at full force. "It felt like someone was watching us," Rachel whispered, determined to shake the unease. Sam drove to the end of the bridge and pulled into a small parking lot overlooking the lake. They sat in silence, the still water below reflecting the moonlight. But the quiet didn't last. A faint tapping sound came from outside the car. Tap, 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 like fingernails on glass. Rachel froze, her eyes darting to the passenger side window. Nothing was there. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice tight. Sam nodded, shifting the car into reverse. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. The shadow was back, standing directly behind the car. Its form was clearer now, almost humanoid, but its face was a void, an absence of light that seemed to swallow everything around it. "It's behind us," Sam said, his voice barely audible. Rachel turned, her scream piercing the silence. The shadow didn't move, didn't approach, but the car's engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out. Panic set in. Sam fumbled with the keys, turning the ignition over and over, but the car refused to start. The shadow began to drift closer, its form shifting like smoke in the wind. The temperature inside the car dropped further, frost creeping across the windows. "Sam, do something," Rachel cried, her voice breaking. With a final turn of the key, the engine roared back to life. Sam slammed the car into drive, the tires squealing as they sped away. In the rearview mirror, the shadow remained on the bridge, watching as they disappeared into the night. Back at home, neither of them spoke for a long time. Rachel sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, while Sam poured himself a drink, his hands still trembling. "What was that?" Rachel finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it wasn't human." The next day, Sam did some digging. He found old newspaper articles about the London Bridge's relocation and the strange incidents that had followed. Workers reported seeing figures on the bridge at night, and locals spoke of ghostly apparitions that seemed tied to the structure's history. One story stood out. In the late 19th century, a man had leapt to his death from the original bridge in London on Christmas Eve. His body never recovered. Sam couldn't shake the thought. Had they encountered the spirit of that man, still tethered to the bridge even after it had been moved halfway across the world? They never drove across the London Bridge at night again, but every Christmas Eve, they stayed up late, peeking out the window toward the distant silhouette of the bridge. And sometimes, just sometimes, they thought they saw a shadow standing in the middle, waiting for the next unwitting traveler to cross its path. Story number 2. The Lights of Superstition Mountain. The Superstition Mountains in Arizona rise jagged and forbidding against the desert sky, their silhouette a dark guardian over Apache Junction. For centuries, they have been the subject of stories, some wondrous, others terrifying. The tales speak of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine, a hidden treasure that has lured countless fortune seekers to their doom. But there's another legend, whispered by locals and hikers alike, the mysterious lights that dance across the mountains on Christmas Eve, said to be the restless spirits of miners who perished in their search for gold. Brady Sinclair didn't believe in ghost stories, a seasoned outdoorsman and documentary filmmaker. He had come to the superstitions to capture the rugged beauty of the landscape and debunk the myths that clung to them. Christmas Eve seemed the perfect time to shoot, quiet, serene, with the added bonus of a compelling angle for his project. He arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, his gear packed tightly in his weathered backpack. The air was crisp, the desert sun sinking low on the horizon. He adjusted his camera, testing the settings as shadows stretched long across the earth. "This is it," he murmured to himself. Time to separate fact from fiction. Brady followed the trail as it wound upward, the terrain growing rougher with each step. The air cooled rapidly as night fell, and the mountains seemed to shift around him, their rocky faces taking on strange, distorted shapes in the fading light. He paused at a ridge, setting up his tripod to capture the sprawling desert below. The town of Apache Junction glittered faintly in the distance, a sea of lights against the encroaching darkness. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement on the mountainside above him. First, he thought it was another hiker, their headlamp catching the rocks. But the light moved erratically, darting back and forth in a way that no human could mimic. It was pale and bluish, like a will-o'-the-wisp, and it seemed to hover just above the ground. Brady's heart quickened. He trained his camera on the light, zooming in as far as the lens would allow. Through the viewfinder, the light pulsed and shimmered, casting faint shadows that danced across the rocky surface. "What the hell?" he muttered, adjusting the focus. The light began to move, ascending the trail at an unnatural speed. Brady hesitated, torn between staying put and following it. His curiosity won out. Grabbing his flashlight, he packed up his gear and started after the mysterious glow. The trail grew steeper, the rocks loose and treacherous underfoot. The light remained just ahead, always out of reach, its movements almost playful. As Brady climbed, The air grew colder, and a strange silence enveloped the mountain. The usual sounds of the desert, the rustle of wind, the distant cry of a coyote were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. He reached a plateau and stopped to catch his breath. The light had vanished, leaving him alone in the dark. Brady swung his flashlight in a wide arc, its beam revealing jagged boulders and scrubby vegetation. Then he heard it, a low, mournful hum, like the wind passing through a hollow cave. It rose and fell, carrying with it an eerie melody that sent a chill down his spine. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the rocks. The hum faded, replaced by the faint sound of voices. They were distant at first, barely audible, but grew louder as he strained to listen. The words were indistinct, a jumble of whispers that seemed to come from all around him. Brady turned in a slow circle, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms faint and translucent. They wore tattered clothing, the kind Brady had seen in old photographs of prospectors. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through him. The bluish light he had followed earlier pulsed faintly within their chests, casting an otherworldly glow. Brady stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figures didn't move, but their presence pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. One of them raised an arm, pointing toward the ridge above. "Go back," a voice whispered, faint but commanding. "This place is not for the living." Brady's legs felt like lead, but he managed to nod. He turned and fled down the trail, the sound of his own panicked footsteps echoing in his ears. The whispers followed him, growing louder, a cacophony of warnings and pleas. When he reached his car, he collapsed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, the lights of Apache Junction a beacon of safety in the distance. Only when he was back in town did he dare to look at the footage on his camera. The images were grainy and dark, but the light was there, clear as day. It flickered and danced, its movements too erratic to be natural. In one frame, he caught a shadowy figure standing on the ridge, its arm outstretched as if pointing. Brady never returned to the Superstition Mountains. His documentary became a sensation, sparking renewed interest in the legends of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine and the haunted trails. But he left out the most chilling details, the voices, the figures, the overwhelming sense of dread that had followed him down the mountain. Every Christmas Eve, as the desert winds howled outside his window, he thought of the lights and the restless spirits that roamed the Superstitions, forever searching for what they had lost. Story number 3. The laughter in Bisbee's abandoned school. Bisbee, Arizona, a small town nestled in the Mule Mountains, carries an air of forgotten history, once a thriving mining community. The streets are now quiet, its buildings weathered by time, but among its many relics, none inspire more fear and fascination than the old Bisbee Elementary School. Shuttered for decades, the building looms over the town like a sentinel of the past, its broken windows and crumbling facade a stark reminder of what was left behind. The locals speak of strange occurrences within the school's decaying walls. They say that on Christmas Eve, when the town is blanketed in the stillness of winter, echoes of laughter and the sound of running footsteps fill the hallways. The ghosts of children, they claim, come out to play. Lydia Hart didn't believe in ghosts. As a journalist for a regional magazine, she had made her career debunking paranormal claims and exposing urban legends. When she heard about the Bisbee School's Christmas Eve phenomenon, she saw it as an opportunity to add another notch to her skeptic's belt. She arrived in Bisbee on December 23rd, her car packed with recording equipment, cameras, and notebooks. The townsfolk were friendly but guarded when she mentioned her plans. "You're staying overnight?" the clerk at the motel asked, his voice tinged with concern. Lydia nodded. I'm hoping to catch something on tape. The clerk frowned. Just be careful. Some things in that school, they don't want to be found. The school sat at the edge of town, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. Lydia parked her car in the overgrown lot and approached the building, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The air was sharp and cold, and the faint scent of pine mingled with the musty odor wafting from the open door. She stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched before her, its tiled floor cracked and littered with debris. Old lockers lined the walls, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off, chalking it up to the winter air. Let's see what's so spooky about this place, she muttered, setting up her equipment in the main corridor. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Lydia wandered through the building, documenting its decay. She found a classroom with overturned desks and a chalkboard that still bore faint traces of equations. Another room held a piano, its keys yellowed and warped. She pressed one experimentally, and the sound that emerged was hollow and discordant. By midnight, she had settled in a corner of the gymnasium, her cameras rolling and her recorder capturing the ambient noise. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the broken windows. Lydia leaned back against the wall, fighting the urge to doze off. Then it began. The laughter was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. Lydia sat up, her pulse quickening. She strained her ears, unsure if she had imagined it. But there it was again, soft, high-pitched giggles, unmistakably those of children. She grabbed her flashlight and scanned the gymnasium. The beam illuminated the basketball hoop, the bleachers, the peeling paint on the walls. But the room was empty. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the building. It wasn't joyous. It was unnerving, carrying an edge that made Lydia's skin crawl. She followed the sound into the hallway, her footsteps echoing alongside the phantom giggles. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The laughter stopped. A sudden crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the rapid patter of footsteps. Lydia's heart raced as she ascended the creaking staircase, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The upper floor was colder, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. She reached a classroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and faint light spilled out into the corridor. Lydia pushed the door open, her breath hitching. The room was filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. Desks were arranged neatly, as if waiting for students, and the chalkboard bore the words, "Merry Christmas, Class of 1954, written in perfect script. In the center of the room stood a group of children, their forms faint and translucent. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. Lydia froze, unable to move or speak. One of the children turned to her, its eyes hollow and dark. A slow smile spread across its face, and it raised a hand, pointing toward the chalkboard. Lydia's gaze followed the gesture. Beneath the holiday greeting was a message scrawled in jagged letters. "Why did you leave us?" The children began to move, their laughter filling the room. It was louder now, deafening, as they darted around her, their movements too fast to follow. Lydia stumbled backward, her flashlight falling from her hand. The beam spun wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, mournful whisper. "Stay with us," it said. Lydia bolted, her footsteps echoing as she fled down the stairs and out into the cold night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, and drove back to the motel without looking back. The next day, Lydia reviewed her footage. The audio captured the laughter clearly, as well as the whisper that had sent her fleeing. But the video was distorted, the images blurred and fragmented. The only clear frame showed the classroom with its message on the chalkboard and the faint outline of the children staring into the camera. Lydia never published her article. The experience stayed with her, a lingering chill she couldn't shake. Every Christmas Eve, She thought of the school and the voices that had called to her, wondering if the children still laughed and played in the shadows of Bisbee's haunted past. Story number 4. The knocking at Tucson Firehouse. The Tucson Firehouse stood as a sentinel against disaster, its brick facade weathered by decades of service. For years, it had been the last line of defense for a city accustomed to blazing heat and unpredictable wildfires. But its history was not without scars. In the early 1980s, a firefighter named Joe Ramirez had lost his life during a rescue mission gone tragically wrong. Since then, whispers had spread among the staff, whispers of strange sounds, ghostly footsteps, and, most famously, the knocking. Every Christmas Eve, it was said, someone or something rapped on the firehouse doors, a reminder of the man who had never truly left. For rookie firefighter Danny Lopez, the legend was little more than a tall tale, an initiation story meant to rattle new recruits. He'd heard it first during training, sitting around the firehouse's communal table, his older colleagues grinning as they regaled him with the details. "It's always Christmas Eve," said Jim, the senior firefighter, a grizzled man with decades of experience. 3 knocks on the bay door, footsteps in the hall. You go check, and there's no one there. And let me guess, Danny had replied, smirking, "You all have seen it?" "Not just seen it," Jim said, his voice low. "Felt it, cold as the grave." Danny had laughed it off then, but now, as he pulled the Christmas Eve shift, he couldn't shake the unease. The firehouse was eerily quiet, the rest of the crew either sleeping or watching old holiday movies in the lounge. Outside, the desert wind howled, rattling the windows and carrying with it a chill unusual for Tucson. The first knock came just after midnight. Danny was in the kitchen, stirring a mug of hot chocolate, when he heard it, a sharp, deliberate rap against the bay door. He froze, the spoon clattering against the counter. "Jim?" he called, though he knew the older firefighter had turned in hours ago. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind pressing against the firehouse. Danny set down his mug and walked toward the bay, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The overhead lights flickered slightly, the old wiring protesting against the storm outside. Reaching the bay door, he hesitated. The heavy steel barrier loomed before him, its surface scuffed and scratched from years of use. He placed a hand against it, the cold metal biting at his skin. Taking a deep breath, he opened the small access window and peered outside. Nothing, just the empty parking lot, bathed in the orange glow of a nearby street lamp. Danny let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Wind," he muttered, closing the window and locking it tight. He was halfway back to the kitchen when the footsteps started. They were faint at first, a soft tread against the linoleum floor. Danny stopped, his heart pounding. "Jim?" he called again, his voice cracking slightly. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward him from the far end of the hall. Danny turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim corridor. There was no one there. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Danny's breath fogged in the air, the temperature suddenly dropping. He rubbed his arms, trying to dispel the chill. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice trembling. "It's just an old building, nothing more." The second knock came at 12:30. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Danny grabbed his radio, calling into the lounge. "Jim? Anyone awake? Are you hearing this?" Static crackled back at him, followed by the faint sound of a Christmas movie playing in the background. No one responded. The knocking continued, 3 sharp raps that reverberated through the bay. Danny's pulse quickened as he approached the door again. The access window felt colder this time, frost forming around its edges. He wiped it clear with his sleeve and looked outside. The parking lot was still empty, but this time, something felt different. The street lamp flickered, its light casting strange, shifting shadows across the asphalt. One of the shadows didn't move with the others. Danny slammed the window shut and stepped back, his breath coming in short. Ragged gasps. The footsteps resumed, this time faster, as if someone were running through the halls. By 1 a.m., Danny had locked himself in the lounge. Jim and the others were still asleep, oblivious to the noises that now filled the firehouse. The knocking had started again, but this time, it came from multiple places: the bay door, the kitchen, the stairwell leading to the dorms. Each knock was followed by footsteps, an endless loop of sound that seemed to surround him. And then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Danny sat frozen in his chair, clutching his radio like a lifeline. He didn't notice the cold until it was too late. A breath of icy air brushed the back of his neck, and he turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Standing in the doorway was a figure, its outline hazy and indistinct. It wore the uniform of a firefighter, the insignia on its chest glinting faintly in the dim light. Joe Ramirez, Danny whispered, the name slipping from his lips unbidden. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to pulse with energy. The knocking resumed, softer this time, like a plea. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the figure spoke, "Help them." Danny woke to the sound of the alarm blaring, jolting him from his chair. The rest of the crew was already moving, suiting up as the dispatcher's voice crackled through the speakers. A house fire on the edge of town, multiple people trapped inside. The crew worked tirelessly that night, saving a family of 4 from the blaze. When they returned to the firehouse, exhausted but victorious, Danny couldn't help but glance at the bay door. The frost had melted, and the oppressive chill was gone. But on the steel surface, faint and unmistakable, were 3 handprints, pressed into the metal as if in thanks. Danny never doubted the stories again, and every Christmas Eve, as the clock struck midnight, he made sure to listen for the knocking, a reminder that some spirits never truly leave, and that heroes like Joe Ramirez are always watching. Story number 5. The Haunted House of Jerome. Jerome, Arizona, perched precariously on Cleopatra Hill, is a town frozen in time, once a bustling mining community. Its fortunes faded with the depletion of the copper veins. Today, it is known as one of America's most haunted towns. Its narrow streets and weathered buildings steeped in tales of tragedy and ghosts. Among its many haunted locations, one house stands out, the abandoned Prescott Manor. On Christmas Eve, locals swear, the house comes alive with footsteps, whispers, and the cold touch of unseen hands. Emma Reynolds didn't believe in ghosts. As a history graduate student, she was far more interested in the facts than the folklore. She arrived in Jerome a few days before Christmas to research the mining town's rise and fall for her thesis. Prescott Manor, with its grim history of deaths and disappearances, was the perfect place to start. "You're staying there?" The barista at the local coffee shop asked when Emma mentioned her plan. Emma nodded, sipping her latte. "It's just a house. Creepy one. Sure. But it's not like I'm afraid of a few ghost stories." The barista's expression darkened. "Be careful," she said. "People say Christmas Eve is when they come back." Prescott Manor loomed at the end of a steep, winding road. The house was a relic of the past, its Victorian architecture weathered by time. Shutters hung askew, and ivy crept up the faded walls. Emma parked her car and hauled her bags inside. The air inside was cold and musty, and her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. She set up her laptop on the dining room table. Surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and journals she'd borrowed from the local library, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house seemed to settle into itself. The creaks and groans of old would filling the silence. Around midnight, Emma was deep into an article about a 1917 mining accident when she heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps above her. She froze, her heart pounding. The house had no electricity, and she'd made sure to lock the doors and windows. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Emma grabbed her flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase. The second floor was colder than the first, the air heavy with an unplaceable scent, a mix of earth and decay. She shone her flashlight into each room, finding nothing but dust and broken furniture. As she turned to head back downstairs, a low creak echoed behind her. She spun around, her beam landing on the hallway's far end. A door she hadn't opened before was ajar, revealing a room bathed in shadows. The room was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A small bed sat against the wall, its quilt faded but intact. A wooden rocking horse stood near the window, and a collection of dolls lined a dusty shelf. Emma stepped inside, her breath visible in the freezing air. The rocking horse moved. Emma stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. The horse swayed gently, its creak rhythmic and deliberate. The dolls on the shelf seemed to watch her, their glass eyes reflecting the beam of her light. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Leave." Emma fled back downstairs, her hands shaking. She locked herself in the dining room, her laptop's glow the only source of comfort. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of too many ghost stories and a sleepless night. But the house didn't let her rest. The footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They moved through the house, up and down the stairs, pausing outside the dining room door. Shadows flitted at the edges of her vision, and the temperature dropped further, her breath fogging in the air. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, a heavy thud against the dining room door. Emma grabbed the nearest object, a candlestick, and stood, her back against the table. "Whoever you are, I'm calling the police," she shouted. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but the darkened hallway beyond. Emma didn't stay the night. She grabbed her laptop and bolted to her car, leaving her bags behind. She drove straight to the hotel in town, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The next day, she returned with a local historian, a man named Tom who had spent his life studying Jerome's haunted history. Together, they explored the house in daylight, the eerie atmosphere diminished by the sun's rays. In the child's bedroom, they found a journal hidden beneath the bed. The entries were written in a careful, childish scrawl, detailing the life of a young girl named Clara Prescott. The last entry was dated December 24th, 1919. "Papa says the miners are coming tonight. He's angry again. I hope they don't yell like last time. Mama says Christmas will make it better. I hope she's right." Tom explained that the Prescott family had vanished that Christmas, their disappearance never solved. Rumors of arguments with disgruntled miners and mysterious deaths had plagued the house ever since. Emma's article on Jerome's haunted history became a local sensation, but she left out the details of her night in Prescott Manor. She never returned to the house, though she often thought of Clara's journal and the whispers that had told her to leave. Every Christmas Eve, she wondered if the footsteps still echoed through the halls and if the rocking horse still swayed, carrying the weight of a century's worth of restless spirits. Story number 6. The Ghosts of the USS Arizona Memorial. The USS Arizona Memorial, floating silently in Pearl Harbor, stands as a solemn reminder of one of the darkest days in American history. Though its physical remains lie beneath the water, its legacy looms large, drawing thousands of visitors who come to pay their respects to the 1.177 sailors who perished aboard the battleship. But for all its reverence, the memorial holds a deeper, spectral secret. On Christmas Eve, some visitors claim to see shadowy figures on the deck, hear the faint echo of footsteps, and glimpse a sailor in his pristine naval uniform, gazing out over the water. Megan Callahan wasn't one for ghost stories. A historian and researcher, she had spent years traveling to historic sites, diving into archives, and unraveling truths hidden in the folds of time. This Christmas, her work had brought her to Hawaii, where she planned to write about the enduring legacy of the USS Arizona. "You'll want to avoid Christmas Eve," the shuttle driver said as they approached the harbor. "That's when the spirits are most active." Megan smiled politely but dismissed the comment. She chalked it up to local superstition, a colorful tale to entertain tourists. Yet, as she stepped onto the memorial, a sense of weight pressed down on her chest, as though the air itself was heavy with memory. The day passed uneventfully. Megan walked the memorial's stark white structure, its simplicity contrasting with the deep blue of the water below. She read plaques, photographed the rusting remnants of the ship visible beneath the surface, and jotted notes in her journal as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the harbor in hues of gold and crimson. She lingered, reluctant to leave. By the time the staff announced the last shuttle back to shore, Megan was alone on the memorial. She had pulled a few strings to remain after hours, eager to capture the quiet solitude of the site for her article. The moon hung low in the sky, its light shimmering on the water, and the faint hum of distant waves filled the air. Then she heard it, a single, deliberate footstep behind her. Megan froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The deck was empty. She scanned the shadows, her breath visible in the cool night air, but nothing stirred. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. The only response was the faint lapping of water against the memorial's edges. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Imagination," and returned to her notes. But the footsteps came again, this time closer. Megan's flashlight flickered, and a chill swept over her. She spun around, her eyes darting across the deck. Near the edge of the memorial, silhouetted against the moonlit water, stood a figure. The man was tall, his posture rigid. He wore a naval uniform, his brass buttons glinting faintly. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Megan opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. The figure turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then he vanished. Megan stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. Her mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and approached the spot where the man had stood. The deck was empty, but the air was colder here, and a faint scent of salt and oil lingered. Determined to understand what she had seen, Megan retrieved her voice recorder and began to speak. "December 24th, 9:30 p.m. I believe I just witnessed something. A man in a naval uniform appeared near the edge of the memorial. Her voice faltered as she heard another sound, the faint murmur of voices, distant and ethereal. She followed the sound to the far end of the memorial, her steps slow and deliberate. The voices grew louder, forming fragmented words and phrases she couldn't quite make out. Then they stopped, replaced by a low, mournful whistle, the kind used to signal a ship's departure. Megan's eyes widened as she saw them, shadows moving across the deck, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They walked in pairs and groups, their movements purposeful. One shadow paused, turning toward her. She felt its gaze, though it had no eyes, and then, like the man before, it disappeared, back on shore. Megan reviewed her recordings. The voices were faint but audible, their tones filled with emotion. She heard snippets of conversation. "All hands on deck, ready the lines," and, chillingly, "It's time." Her footage revealed more, faint figures moving along the deck, their outlines flickering like old film reels. In one frame, she saw the man in the uniform again, his hand raised in what looked like a salute. Megan's article was a sensation, blending history with the paranormal in a way that captivated readers. She wrote about the sailors who had given their lives, the enduring memory of the USS Arizona, and the inexplicable phenomena she had encountered. But she left out the most personal detail, the message she had heard in her final moments on the memorial. As she had packed her things to leave, a voice had whispered in her ear, clear and undeniable. Remember us. Every Christmas Eve, Megan thought of the USS Arizona Memorial, of the shadows and whispers that haunted its deck. She never returned, but the echo of those bells, the steps of unseen sailors, and the weight of their sacrifice stayed with her always. Story number 7. The Ghost of the Orpheum Theater. The Orpheum Theater in Phoenix, Arizona, is a masterpiece of opulent architecture. Built in the 1920s, this grandeur is a testament to the golden age of entertainment, with a stage that has hosted countless performances over the decades. Yet, beneath its beauty lies a lingering chill. The staff and performers whisper of a ghostly presence. A young woman in a flowing white dress who appears in the front row every Christmas season, only to vanish when approached. For Emily Harper, a stage manager with a taste for the theatrical and a healthy skepticism for ghost stories. The tales of the Orpheum's Christmas ghost were nothing more than folklore. She'd worked at the theater for years, ensuring that shows went off without a hitch. And while she'd heard the rumors, she dismissed them as fanciful exaggerations. This Christmas Eve, the theater was alive with activity. A holiday production was underway, and the cast and crew were buzzing with excitement. Emily stood backstage, her headset crackling with updates from her team. 5 minutes to curtain, she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. The performers rushed to their places, their costumes shimmering under the glow of the stage lights. Emily double-checked her clipboard, her eyes scanning the schedule. Everything was running smoothly. The first act unfolded without incident. The audience laughed and clapped in all the right places, their energy fueling the performers. Emily watched from the wings, a small smile of satisfaction on her face. But as the second act began, something caught her eye. In the dim light of the theater, she noticed a figure seated in the front row. It was a young woman, her pale dress glowing faintly in the darkness. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the stage. Emily frowned. That seat had been empty before the show started. She leaned closer, her heart skipping a beat. The woman's features were indistinct, as though she were a photograph slightly out of focus. Emily shook her head, trying to dispel the unease creeping up her spine. Just a latecomer, she muttered to herself. At intermission, Emily walked into the auditorium, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The woman was gone. She approached the seat, her footsteps echoing in the empty theater. The velvet cushion was cool to the touch, as if no one had been sitting there. Weird, she said, shaking her head. She turned to leave but paused when she noticed something on the floor. A faint, wet footprint, smaller than her own, led away from the seat and disappeared into the aisle. The final act was underway when the whispers started. Emily was backstage, coordinating cues, when she heard it, a soft, melodic hum, like someone singing a lullaby. She looked around, her brow furrowing. None of the cast were offstage, and the crew were too busy to be singing. Did anyone hear that? She asked through her headset. Hear what? Came the reply from the lighting technician. Emily didn't answer. She followed the sound, her steps taking her closer to the stage. The humming grew louder, weaving through the air like a ghostly melody. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, after the show, as the cast celebrated another successful performance. Emily stayed behind to lock up. The theater was quiet now, its grandeur bathed in the soft glow of the house lights. She walked the aisles, checking for forgotten belongings and ensuring everything was in order. As she neared the front row, she felt it again, the cold. Her breath fogged in the air, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The young woman was there, seated in the same spot as before. This time, Emily could see her more clearly. Her dress was vintage, delicate lace and silk that seemed to shimmer faintly. Her hair was dark, framing a face that was pale and hauntingly beautiful. But it was her eyes that held Emily's gaze, deep, sorrowful, and filled with an unspoken plea. "Hello," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. Emily watched, frozen, as the woman turned and began to walk down the aisle toward the stage. Her bare feet made no sound against the carpeted floor. "Wait," Emily called. Finding her voice, she followed, her heart pounding. The woman reached the stage and stepped onto it without hesitation. For a moment, she stood in the center, her gaze sweeping over the empty seats. Then she turned to Emily, her lips moving silently. Emily stepped closer, trying to understand. "What are you saying?" The woman's form began to fade, her outline blurring like smoke caught in a breeze. But just before she disappeared entirely, Emily heard it, a single word, carried on a whisper. "Remember." The next day, Emily scoured the theater's archives, desperate for answers. She found an old program from 1932, the edges yellowed with age. On the cover was a photograph of the cast, their faces frozen in time. Among them was the young woman, her lace dress unmistakable. Her name was Eleanor Hart, a rising star who had died tragically during a Christmas Eve performance. The details were vague, but the program mentioned her dedication to the theater and her love for the art of performance. Emily never spoke of what she'd seen that night, but every Christmas Eve, as the Orpheum stage lights dimmed and the audience settled in, she found herself glancing at the front row, and sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she saw a flicker of white lace and the faintest hint of a smile. Story number 8. The Christmas Ghosts of Monte Vista. The Monte Vista Hotel in Flagstaff, Arizona, rises like a relic of the past, its brick facade and neon sign a testament to its Jazz Age origins. Built in 1927, the hotel has hosted celebrities, travelers, and, according to local lore, the supernatural. During Christmas, its halls seem to hum with a life of their own, or perhaps the remnants of lives long gone. Guests report hearing the laughter of unseen children, and more than one has claimed to see a woman in a red dress gliding through the ballroom, her presence as chilling as the winter air. For Megan Carter, a travel writer chasing unique holiday stories, the Monte Vista was irresistible. Her editor's pitch was simple: spend Christmas Eve at the hotel, dig into its history, and uncover the truth behind the ghost stories. Megan, a skeptic with a love of old buildings, was more intrigued by the hotel's vintage charm than its haunted reputation. "People love a good ghost story," her editor had said. "Just don't get spooked and bail on me." Megan had laughed. "I'll believe it when I see it." The Monte Vista lobby was warm and inviting, its polished wood paneling glowing in the light of a massive Christmas tree adorned with vintage ornaments. The faint strains of holiday music played from hidden speakers, and a cheerful receptionist handed Megan her room key with a knowing smile. "Room 305, the woman said. "You're right near the ballroom. It's a favorite for activity." "Activity?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. The receptionist's smile widened. "You'll see." The room was quaint, its Art Deco furnishings a nod to the hotel's glamorous past. Megan set up her laptop on the small writing desk and began typing notes for her article. Outside, snow fell softly, muffling the sounds of the bustling town below. By midnight, the hotel was quiet. Megan, restless from hours of work, decided to explore. She grabbed her notebook and camera, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air felt heavier as she neared the ballroom, the faint scent of perfume mingling with the smell of aged wood and varnish. She pushed open the heavy double doors, her flashlight sweeping the vast space. The ballroom was as grand as she had imagined, with a high ceiling, a glittering chandelier, and an empty dance floor that seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness. Then she heard it, the faint, melodic sound of children laughing. Megan froze, her breath catching. The laughter was distant but unmistakable, growing louder as if approaching from the far end of the hall. She turned her flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed only empty space. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with anticipation. Megan's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting across the far wall. She took a step forward, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. The chandelier above her swayed slightly, its crystals tinkling like wind chimes. Then, from behind her, came the sound of footsteps. Megan spun around, her flashlight shaking in her grip. Standing at the edge of the dance floor was a woman. She wore a deep red dress, its fabric shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, and her face was pale, her lips painted a vivid crimson. "Ma'am," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She turned gracefully, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and began to walk toward the center of the ballroom. Megan followed, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "Who are you?" Megan asked, her words echoing in the cavernous space. The woman stopped abruptly. She turned her head slightly, just enough for Megan to catch a glimpse of her profile. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished. Megan stumbled back, her heart pounding. She fumbled for her camera, snapping photos of the empty ballroom. The chandelier above her had stopped swaying, and the air felt unnaturally cold. "It's just my imagination," she whispered to herself. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the laughter of children, this time accompanied by the faint sound of music, as if a gramophone were playing a long-forgotten tune. Back in her room, Megan reviewed her photos. Most were unremarkable, but one made her stomach drop. In the center of the frame, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of the woman in red. Her face was turned toward the camera, her expression unreadable, determined to find answers. Megan spent Christmas morning digging through the hotel's archives. She learned that the woman in red had been a frequent guest in the 1940s. A singer, she had performed in the ballroom for holiday galas. According to legend, she had died tragically one Christmas Eve, collapsing on the dance floor during her final performance. As for the children, their origins were murkier. Some speculated they were the spirits of children who had lived in the hotel during its time as a temporary shelter during the Great Depression. Others believed they were simply echoes of the past, fragments of joy preserved in the building's bones. Megan's article became a sensation, blending history and the paranormal in a way that captivated readers. But she left out the most personal details: the laughter, the woman's piercing gaze, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Every Christmas Eve, she thought of the Monte Vista and the ghosts that called it home. And though she never returned, she couldn't forget the faint scent of perfume and the echo of laughter that followed her long after she'd left. Story number 9. The Carols in Coconino Forest. The Coconino National Forest, sprawling and ancient, holds mysteries as deep as its towering pines. Under the canopy of evergreens, the world feels timeless, untouched by the march of progress. But during the long, cold nights of December, the forest whispers secrets that many would rather not hear. Campers and hikers speak in hushed tones of a chilling phenomenon. On Christmas Eve, carols echo through the trees, sung by voices that seem both near and impossibly far. No one knows who sings them or why. Jake and Lily were the kind of couple who sought out adventure wherever they could find it. For them, Christmas in the city held no appeal. This year, they decided to spend the holiday camping in the remote wilderness of Coconino. The idea of a quiet escape, surrounded by the beauty of snow-draped pines, was too tempting to resist. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Lily asked as they unpacked their gear at the edge of a secluded clearing. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the snow. "It's perfect," Jake said, grinning. "Just us, the forest, and a couple of nights away from everything." Lily nodded, though she couldn't shake a lingering unease. There was something about the stillness of the woods, the way the trees seemed to lean in, as if listening. By the time they'd set up their tent and built a small fire, darkness had fallen. The flames crackled and spit, their light casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Jake cooked dinner while Lily sipped hot chocolate from a thermos, her eyes scanning the dark forest beyond the firelight. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake paused, listening. "Hear what?" "Singing," Lily said. "Like carols." Jake shook his head, smiling. "It's probably just the wind. You know how it whistles through the trees." Lily frowned but said nothing. She wasn't so sure. Hours later, they lay in their sleeping bags, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Jake was snoring softly, but Lily remained awake, her unease growing with every passing minute. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your own breathing sound deafening. Then she heard it again, faint and melodic, the unmistakable sound of voices singing. This time, there was no mistaking it. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, a hymn she couldn't quite place. The voices were high and clear, harmonizing in a way that sent chills down her spine. "Jake," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Jake, wake up." Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "Listen," Lily said, her voice trembling. Jake sat up, frowning. The singing was louder now, though still distant, as if carried on the wind. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the freezing air. Lily followed, clutching her coat tightly around her. The forest was bathed in moonlight, the snow glittering like a million tiny diamonds. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the trees with an almost otherworldly quality. "Hello," Jake called, his voice echoing. The singing stopped. They stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them. Then, faintly, the singing resumed, this time closer. Jake turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The light caught on a trail of footprints in the snow, small and bare, leading deeper into the woods. "No way," Lily said, grabbing his arm. "We're not following that." Jake hesitated, but curiosity burned in his chest. "What if someone needs help?" "Jake, it's freezing," Lily said. No one would be out here barefoot. But Jake had already started walking. Lily cursed under her breath and followed, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically as they trudged through the snow. The footprints led them to a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal arms. Beneath it, the snow was undisturbed, but the singing was louder here, enveloping them in an eerie chorus. Jake stepped closer to the tree, his flashlight flickering. "It's coming from here," he said, his voice barely audible. Lily grabbed his arm. "Jake, let's go. Now." Before he could respond, the singing stopped again. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Then, from behind the tree, a figure emerged. It was a child, or at least it appeared to be. She wore a tattered white dress, her bare feet sinking into the snow. Her hair was long and dark, obscuring her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed behind them. Lily turned, her heart racing. The forest was no longer empty. Figures stood among the trees, their forms faint and translucent. Men, women, and children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and hollow. They stared silently, their eyes fixed on Jake and Lily. "Run," Lily whispered, grabbing Jake's hand. They bolted, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as they stumbled through the snow. The singing resumed, louder and more discordant, as if the forest itself were alive with sound. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a heavy weight pressing against Lily's back. When they reached their campsite, they didn't stop. Jake grabbed their essentials, and they fled to their car, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the forest. The singing faded as the miles stretched between them and the trees, but its haunting melody remained etched in their minds. Later, when they spoke to locals about their experience, an old man nodded solemnly. "You're lucky you left," he said. "The forest doesn't like visitors on Christmas. Those voices? They're the lost souls of settlers and travelers who never made it out." Jake and Lily never camped again, but every Christmas Eve, when the world grew quiet and the snow fell softly outside their window, they'd hear it in their dreams, the haunting carols of Coconino Forest, calling to them from the shadows. Story number 10. The Bells of Mission San Xavier del Bac. The Mission San Xavier del Bac, with its white stucco walls and ornate towers, stands like a guardian against the desert's vastness. Built in the late 18th century, it is a sanctuary of faith and history, but as beautiful as it is by day. The mission takes on a different aura at night, especially on Christmas Eve, when the bells of the old tower are said to ring on their own, echoing across the desert. Locals claim it's the call of spirits, returning to the sacred grounds they once knew. For Claire Davenport, a journalist chasing stories of the supernatural, the legend of the mission's bells was irresistible. A self-proclaimed skeptic, she had made a career out of investigating haunted locations, exposing hoaxes while occasionally encountering things she couldn't explain. The mission was her next stop. She arrived in Tucson on December 23rd. The desert air cool but dry. The locals she interviewed spoke of the phenomenon with reverence. The bells ring for the departed. An elderly man told her outside a coffee shop. They call the spirits home, just for a night. Another woman, a volunteer at the mission, warned Claire, "Don't go alone," she said. "The spirits don't always want company." Claire dismissed the warnings with a polite smile. She had heard similar things before, and while she respected the history of the mission, she wasn't ready to believe in ghostly bells. On Christmas Eve, Claire parked her car in the mission's gravel lot just before midnight. The structure loomed in the moonlight, its towers casting long shadows over the courtyard. Armed with a camera, a voice recorder, and a flashlight, she made her way inside. The interior was silent, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, where candles flickered gently. Claire set up her equipment at the back of the nave, her camera trained on the bell tower. For the first hour, nothing happened. Claire jotted notes in her notebook, listening to the faint rustle of the desert wind outside. Then, at 1:03 a.m., the first bell rang. The sound was deep and resonant, filling the air with a mournful clarity. Claire froze, her pen poised above the page. The bell rang again and again, each toll steady and deliberate. She grabbed her flashlight and aimed it at the tower. The rope hung motionless, swaying faintly in the breeze. The mechanism that operated the bell had long since been disconnected, and no one was visible in the tower's shadowed windows. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing through the mission. The bells fell silent. Claire climbed the narrow staircase leading to the bell tower, her flashlight illuminating the worn stone steps. The air grew colder as she ascended, a sharp contrast to the desert's usual warmth. At the top, she found herself face to face with the massive bell, its surface tarnished with age. She inspected the room carefully. There was no one there. The rope dangled lifelessly, untouched. As she leaned closer to examine the bell, she noticed something etched into its surface. Faint markings, almost like names, worn down over centuries. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft and fleeting, like the rustle of leaves. She spun around. her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The only response was a faint breeze, carrying with it the scent of something old and sweet, like dried flowers. Claire descended the stairs, her mind racing, back in the nave. She reviewed the footage on her camera. The bells had rung clearly, their sound captured perfectly, but as she scanned the video, she noticed something else. Faint, shadowy figures moving in the background. They seemed to drift through the pews, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. Suddenly, the bells rang again, louder this time, their tolls reverberating through the mission. Claire's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the air grew icy cold. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure stood near the altar, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, its features obscured, but its presence was undeniable. Claire's breath caught as the figure turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Why are you here?" a voice whispered, faint but clear. Claire backed away, her heart hammering. The figure began to dissolve, fading into the darkness like smoke. The bells rang once more, their mournful tone filling the empty space. At dawn, Claire left the mission, her hands shaking as she packed up her equipment. She spent the next day reviewing the footage and audio recordings. The bells were clear, their tones unearthly and haunting. The whispers were faint but discernible, fragments of words she couldn't piece together. And then there were the shadows. On the video, they moved in and out of the pews, gathering near the altar as the bells rang. At one point, a face appeared briefly in the frame, pale, serene, and unmistakably human. Claire's article on the Mission San Xavier del Bac became one of her most popular pieces. She wrote about the history, the architecture, and the community's deep connection to the site, but she left out the details of her own encounter, the shadows and whispers that had filled the mission on Christmas Eve. Every year after, as the holidays approached, Claire found herself thinking of the bells and the spirits they called home. She never returned to the mission, but the sound of those tolls lingered in her memory, a haunting reminder of the night she'd stood on sacred ground, surrounded by the echoes of the past. From mysterious lights on mountain trails to ghostly figures in historic theaters, these stories remind us that even the holiday season isn't immune to the paranormal. Which tale gave you the biggest chills? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more haunting stories and supernatural journeys. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some spirits never take a holiday.